Before we get started, if you find yourself enjoying this story, please consider giving it a like and hit subscribe. As a new and growing channel, every subscription is incredibly impactful. Thanks for supporting our channel and enjoy the story. I immigrated to the United States from Russia 10 years ago, but before that, I was a truck driver. I often drove the route with the seemingly innocuous name of the M56, a road that Stalin had built with the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, slaves to the gulags. They were people the state had, in effect, condemned to death, and the state didn't want them back. About half of them died. They froze to death, starved and collapsed from exhaustion. And to this day, many drivers swear they see ghosts on the M56. Traveling up on the M56, I would come to the Kolyma Highway, which translated means the Road of Bones. It isn't a metaphor. When the Gulag prisoners died constructing these roads, they wouldn't bury their bodies, due to the permafrost making the ground too hard. So the prisoners' bones were mixed in with the road and covered over. The road itself literally has the bones of many tens of thousands of people mixed in. To call the M56 or the Road of Bones roads gives the wrong impression, at least on the last time I drove the route back in 2010. It isn't a paved road, but covered in stones laid thickly over the Siberian dirt that turns into quicksand when it rains. The M56 runs straight north into Siberia, and there are still countless deaths on this road. It often washes out, and portions of the road used to just collapse. Massive dust storms sweep across it, causing collisions and deaths as trucks and cars swerved into trees or passed into the other side of the road. And my cargo was entirely uninsured. I drove with tons of beer and glass bottles in the back, some of which ended up shattering from the endless vibrations of driving over the sharp rocks all over the road, which also ended up slicing up my tires. I would go through over 15 tires a month, sometimes 25. Take a truck loaded with between 15 to 18 tons of beer and blow out a tire, and you could be sitting on an instantaneous fatal crash waiting to happen. All down the M56, you would see thousands and thousands of discarded tires on the sides of the road. As for the beer, the people living in northern Siberia loved beer. I think they drank it more than water. Beer is more popular there than vodka, despite the fact it's in Russia. Maybe beer is cheaper than bottled water. In some places it is. The story of my encounter on the M56 started before I had stopped at the warehouse dock to load up 15 tons of beer in my aging, second-hand Japanese truck. It started when I saw a man standing outside just staring at me. He had very dark eyes and a round Siberian face with ruddy cheeks. He wore a fur jacket, but I couldn't tell which animal it could have come from. He looked bundled up, with sweaters and multiple layers of pants. The fur coat also included a hood, which still had the face of the animal attached, though flattened and distorted. I immediately recognized that it had come from a brown bear. I got out of my truck, lighting up a cigarette, and I started walking in his direction, pulling my jacket closed and putting a thick woolen hat on my head. The wind whipped crazily all around me, sending the snow sideways and directly into my face. I cursed, trying to turn my head. The front door stood just beside the strange man, and I needed to go inside. Might as well start the paperwork now, I figured. The man just kept staring, however, even as I got near. I was about to ask if he had a problem when he started speaking. "You are going on Kolyma, the Road of Bones?" he asked. "Yes, I take the M56 north first," I said. "That is my job. I travel here and travel there. As long as most of the cargo doesn't get broken or fall off the truck, I make a decent living." "You should not go alone," he said. "The Road of Bones will break you. It will crush you, as it crushed the bones of those who built it. You will not survive this journey, my friend. Not alone." I laughed, but a chill ran down my spine. "What are you, some kind of Siberian shaman?" I asked. He smiled but said nothing. "Are you a psychic, friend? Do you tell me my future?" "I only tell you the truth," he said. "No more and no less. Many thought they would survive the road of bones. Most still lay there, skulls eternally grinning under the wheels that pass over them." "So what are you asking me?" I said. "I'm not asking you anything," he said. "But if you want any chance to survive, I should come with you. I will travel with you to Magadan, at the end of the road of bones, and then you will be free. You will have seen the true nature of the road of bones, and maybe you'll be alive." I squinted at the man, wondering if I was talking to a madman or a drunkard, but he seemed completely coherent and logical. I wondered if maybe this was just the strangest hitchhiking ruse anyone had ever dreamed up. I stepped back, feeling cold. The smell of fumes from the other trucks pulling into the warehouse parking lot, mixed with the scent of the evergreens that surrounded us here at the edge of town. "What's your name?" I asked him, looking closer at the skin on his fur coat. It looked like bear. It felt too hot standing next to the heat of the warehouse to be wearing fur. "Yakov," he said. "In my town they call me Yakov the Seer." I suppressed a slight smile at this. "Yakov, my name is Nikolai. Yes, I am a truck driver. Why do you not just ask me for a ride?" "Because I want you to prepare yourself," he said cryptically, and then he would say nothing else on the subject, but simply told me he would come back once my cargo was loaded. I smiled and shook his hand, but as I walked away, I felt him staring at my back. Goosebumps rose on my arms and legs, and I wondered whether I had made the right call. Soon, the truck was loaded, and I was ready to leave the lot. I stood in front of the door and looked around Yakov, but the thick snow obscured my vision. I couldn't see farther than 15 or 20 feet in any direction. Shrugging, I pulled myself into the driver's seat and pulled the door close. The warm air from the truck made my tingling toes and fingers warm up. I took off my snow-covered jacket and hat. The smell of wet wool still reminds me of winter to this day. Then there was a sudden rapping at my window. I jumped, reaching under my seat for my P96 pistol, which I always kept loaded and hidden in case of bandits. But as I looked, I saw Yakov's round, serious face looking in at me. I sighed, motioning for him to go around and get in. Because this was an old Japanese truck, it meant that the driver and passenger sides were switched from typical US or Russian convention, even though I still drove on the right side of the road. Yakov had a small leather sack with him that bulged with his few possessions. He sat down, looked over at me, and gave me a faint smile. "Let's go," he said. "We have a very long ride." Indeed, we did. At least 72 hours up to Yakutsk, where I would drop off the entire load of beer, and then a trip from Yakutsk to Magadan, which could take another 5 days. I then had to pick up another load in Magadan, a contract I had already accepted. They expected me there in 8 days. I would have to drive, perhaps 17 or 18 hours a day to make it in time. I set off slowly, the wind howling outside, and the snow quickly covering the windshield. As I puttered down the paved road and towards the M56, Yakov told me a story. "I used to be a driver on the M56 as well," Yakov said. "One time I had a load of vodka to transport to Yakutsk. It was summer. Dust blew so thickly across the road that I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. I was afraid I would go off the road and flip the truck. Night had started to fall, so I pulled over on the side of the road and fell asleep. I awoke to a tapping on the door. I looked out, but no one stood there. I wondered if it was a trick. Bandits are known to rob truckers along these roads, as you know, and sometimes they even block the road with disabled vehicles to force the trucker to stop. Then they come out, drunk and armed, and steal whatever he's transporting." I nodded. I had heard many such stories. I had an old Makarov pistol, must have been from the time of Stalin himself. He laughed. But I'll tell you, the Makarov is a good gun. As long as you clean it and take care of it, it lasts a long time. Just like the AK-47. Cheap and durable. I grabbed my Makarov and a flashlight and began to shine the light out the windows. The dust had greatly receded, and now I could see at least 30 or 40 feet in every direction. To my amazement, I saw people working in the middle of the night. But they looked strange and ethereal. They dug at the road with their hands, using half-broken shovels and rocks and ancient rusted wheelbarrows to move the dirt. I rubbed my eyes, wondering if I was just dreaming. I saw the identification sewn into the back of their jackets, a series of numbers that would replace that person's name as they used to do in the gulags. I started my truck, intending to get the hell out of there, and as soon as the engine made a noise, they all turned to look at me. They had woolen caps and thinly padded jackets, with holes in their pants. None wore gloves. They shivered, trembling, even though it was warm out at the time. And then I noticed the horrific wounds each of them had. Many had gunshot wounds to the head, while others had crushed arms or hands. Each looked like a skeleton, starved nearly to death. They were all dead. They had to be. I drove forwards, hoping they would move out of the way, but they didn't. Very slowly, I drove towards one of the men in the group, one whose face had been destroyed by a gunshot wound, turned into a mask of bone splinters and gore. He just stared up at me as I approached. I kept moving forward slowly, and I passed right through him. By the time I had gotten a few dozen feet up, I turned around and saw they were all gone. We had come onto the M56 by this point, and the whole truck vibrated horribly, shaking on the loose dirt and stones that comprised the road. I looked over at Yakov for a moment, wondering if he was pulling my leg. "Haven't you ever seen anything?" he asked. "Well, I have, but not ghosts," I said. "Not the ghosts of Stalinism." I opened a fresh pack of cigarettes, taking one out and lighting it. I rolled down the window slightly. The bitterly cold wind began to whip into the truck, raising goosebumps all over my body. A cold wave of dread went down my spine, but for another reason. I didn't want to think of the story, and yet I told it anyway. It was winter, very cold, just like now. I was driving down the M56 and found a car on the side of the road. Its hazards were on and its engine was not running. We never turn our engines off here in the winter, because they won't start again in the freezing cold. Not at -60 or -70 with the wind chill. I instantly knew the driver was in trouble. I pulled the truck over and got out. I examined the car and saw the windows smashed. Shards of broken glass all over the seats and floor. And the driver's seat, it looked like it was covered in blood, and yet no driver. I checked under the car and looked in the nearby forest, shining my flashlight through the trees. I called out for the driver, asking if he was hurt. For a long moment, no one answered me, and then I heard it. An answer, very faint, but with each of the words still recognizable. "Please," it said, "I'm hurt. Come deeper into the woods and help me." Its voice did not sound normal. At first, I wondered if it was just the voice of an injured man, but it had a hissing quality, a low, gurgling tone. I tried to think fast and simply called out a question. "Did you get in a car crash?" I asked. "What happened?" The voice came back again after a few long seconds of silence, and it just said the same thing, in the same identical cadence and speed, as if a recording played in the woods on repeat. "Please, I'm hurt. Come deeper into the woods and help me." At that point, I decided that I would leave immediately. Something felt wrong with the situation. I couldn't put my finger on it, but my intuition screamed at me that something didn't add up. I turned to go, and on the other side of the road, I saw, well, something. I'm not sure what it was. It was like a man but hairless, its skin shrunken and pale, totally bleached white against its bones. It looked starved, its knees knobby, its legs just consisting of bones wrapped with skin like white sticks. Standing there totally naked, without sex organs, without eyebrows, its nose and ears missing. I wondered if it was human at all. Now, looking back on it, I know it was not. Its eyes looked like shining orbs of pure blackness, huge pools of liquid black that stared at me, unblinking. And then it opened its mouth, showing many twisted and crooked yellow teeth. "Please, I'm hurt," it said, never changing its expression. It sounded like a recording, and I heard the same words behind me, coming from the forest. "Please," another one said, maybe only 10 feet behind me from the sound. I ran towards my truck, and I heard footsteps behind me, at least 2 pairs and maybe more. I didn't look back. I ran for my life and flung open the door. Just as I was closing it, a hand grabbed my leg. I shrieked, trying over and over again to close the door. I kept slamming against the thin, long white hand that had me. Eventually, it let go, and I started the truck and got out of there. When I looked back, I saw dozens of pairs of black eyes, staring at me, unblinking. After we had told our stories, I drove on in silence for an hour, only the soft patterning of snow against the truck breaking the monotony. I considered putting on some music, then decided against it. Yakov broke the silence after what felt like a very long time. "My grandfather died here, you know," he said. "The M56. He died building it, sent to the gulags because one of his neighbors had a grudge against him over a land dispute. His neighbor went to the secret police and told them my grandfather was hoarding food and had said Stalin should be killed. Of course, none of that was true, but during those days, a grudge was good enough to guarantee you a death sentence. I remember them coming at night. 2 men in long black overcoats with bowler hats on their heads, fashionably angled to the left. They barely spoke. My grandfather answered the door. They said a few words, and then he was gone. I was in the kitchen with my grandmother, and by the time I left, I only found an open door and the autumn night outside. I looked around, hoping to see my grandfather just smoking his pipe or sitting out on the porch, but I never saw him again. We never got his body back, and I only found out he died because one of his fellow prisoners ended up surviving. He lived in the same town as me, and when he came back after 5 years in the gulags, he told me my grandfather would never return. He told me that he had a message for me, that my grandfather loved me and would always be with me, and that I should be strong. I cried for a long time. The townsman said my grandfather had collapsed one day while working in the winter, his body unable to deal with the constant sub-zero temperatures and starvation anymore. The guard came over, shot him in the head, and then they kept building the road, throwing dirt and stones over his body. Soon, the townsman said, he was buried under the road, next to a dozen other bodies that had died during work that day. I think maybe that's why the ghosts called out to me here. I never wanted to work as a driver on this road, but this is the only road leading north to Yakutsk, and I had few job options. Yet, knowing I drove over my grandfather's body every time I drove the truck made me want to, I don't know, get revenge or even destroy the road itself. I just don't know. He stopped. My heart was racing. I wondered how much he knew about me. Strangely enough, my grandfather had also been in the gulags, but not as a prisoner. He had guarded them and likely shot them and tortured them as well, like all of the guards in that hellish place. I never knew my grandfather, and he died of a heart attack before I was born. And yet, I shared the same last name and my parents even said I looked just like him, with gray eyes, high cheekbones, and thick, wavy black hair. I had a narrow, angular face and a thin, muscular body, the same build as him as well. I was told we could have been twins. I looked in the rearview mirror, seeing my own face and the face of my grandfather, like another face glimpsed behind a mask. I saw headlights approaching behind us. At first, I thought nothing of it, assuming it just another driver on his way to deliver goods. But they drove far too fast for the conditions. With the snow, the rocks, and the unstable nature of the road itself, I felt a sense of unease at the dangerous speed at which the driver approached. I changed the subject quickly, not wanting to talk about my family's past. "I think we're being followed," I said. Yakov spun his head, his eyes widening as he stared at the twin beams behind us. "They're going far too fast," he said, and then I saw it. Ahead of us sat a totaled car, a rusted heap of metal without windows. The front driver's side looked smashed in, as if it had hit a tree or a large stone. The snow had already filled the interior, covering the seats and upholstery, and I barely saw it in time. I immediately started slowing down, knowing that a truck loaded with this much weight would take much longer than a usual car to stop. "Someone rolled this out here," I said. "I think this is an ambush." Just saying the words made my breath stop. I quickly tried to calculate our odds. I was grateful that I had Yakov and that he was armed. I reached under my seat and pulled out my P-96 pistol. "Do you have any weapons, Yakov?" By now the headlights had gone from pinpricks to dull, moon-like orbs in the snow, and I was rapidly slowing the truck so I wouldn't hit the car barricaded across the road, trying to keep moving so I wouldn't slide off the road. Yakov quickly undid his bulging pack and reached through, looking for something, frowning. Then he smiled, pulling his hand up and showing me a Makarov pistol. "I thought you said you had a Makarov," I said. "Okay, whatever, I don't care." I looked closer at it. It was one of the oldest guns I had ever seen, outside of a museum or a collection. The Makarov came to somewhat of a point near the barrel, narrowing in a curve at the end. It had a wooden hand grip, deeply worn by handling over the decades, and the metal had tarnished and turned a dark color. But as a whole, it still looked like a beautiful gun, and an antique for sure. I wondered whether it actually fired, this gun from maybe 70 or 80 years ago. I hoped, for our sake, that it did. The lights had nearly reached us by now, and I had managed to stop the truck fully about 30 feet away from the barricaded car. It was the farthest away I could manage, under the conditions. I wanted room to back up or turn around or to accelerate and run over bandits if it came to that. I could probably smash the car out of the way of my truck if it were life or death, at least. So I hoped at the time. Looking back now all these years later, I realize how naive I was at that moment. I saw men approaching out of the woods, hooded and covered from head to toe in black. Each had guns. The truck behind us had stopped. I saw a Toyota pickup truck, extremely old and rusted. I saw it had 3 sets of tires, 2 in the back, a dually. It looked modified, as many cars in Russia are. Yet with 6 tires and no load to carry, it could move across the M56 at a speed greater than my own. I certainly couldn't outrun it unless I shot out one of its tires and slowed them down enough for me to find help. This area was deserted, but there were very small towns of nomads or natives in the region. 4 men got out of the pickup truck, each carrying a rifle. We were hopelessly outmatched here. I wondered if we would die. I doubted it, but really, what did I know about bandits? Perhaps our bones would simply join the hundreds of thousands of others who had died here. Perhaps they, too, would become part of the road. "Get out!" the man in front screamed at us. Covered in a ski mask, I could only see his eyes, but they looked bleary and unfocused. His gaze kept flicking from us to the woods, then around the area, then returned back to me. I wondered if these men were all drunk. Very likely. If so, it may be easier to fight them off. I looked over at Yakov, who sat in his seat, trembling slightly, the gun in his hand. He looked at me, and I could see the terror I felt reflected in his eyes. "Should we fight?" he asked desperately. I had no idea. This had never happened before. I had heard stories, but... "Get out now, or we shoot!" the man screamed at us, breaking my thoughts. "Yes, we must fight," I said softly, as if the man outside could hear me. "They might kill us. I'm not taking that chance. At least if we fight, we might be able to keep our fates in our hands alone. These men are likely drunk and not very accurate with their guns. We might have the advantage here." I looked over at the man in front, seeing him raise his gun and aim it at me. I ducked down, and a minute later, a bullet flew through the driver's side door. The crack of it shattered the otherwise muffled sounds of the blizzard. I felt cold air rush into the car through the hole. I rolled down my window while still ducking down in my seat, praying to God for help. I saw Yakov duck down as well, shaking like a leaf, his hands trembling badly. I sat up quickly, aiming and firing at the man in front. He stood there, his gun pointed down, talking to the other men. The shot hit him in the chest, and he dropped, screaming. I saw splatters of blood in the pure white snow around him, little islands of red in an eternally white landscape. Shooting a gun in such a confined space made my ears ring, and for a moment I could hear nothing. I saw the rest of the men had met in a circle when I shot him, both the ones from the forest and the ones from the pickup truck. It would make it easier to pick them all off, one by one, so I hoped anyway. I counted 7 more men to kill or disable, yet I hoped that if I killed a few, the rest would flee. They wanted easy targets and quick money, not men with guns who shot back. They all raised their guns to fire into the truck, swearing at us and yelling for us to surrender or die, when a shrill, ear-splitting sound suddenly came out of the forest. They looked away, their guns still pointed at us, their fingers on the triggers. I heard them babbling to each other in panicked, low voices. Then they all began to run in unison back towards their pickup truck. They didn't even give us a backwards glance, or try to grab the body of their fallen comrade. They ran for their lives, as if they had heard that sound before, and knew exactly what it was. I had no idea, however. I thought some strange Siberian animal would come flying out of the woods, some species I had never seen before. But this seemed far better than a group of armed men. "Oh, thank God," I said. "They're leaving. Now we just need to push this car out of the road and we can get the hell out of here." Yakov nodded, still looking nervous, still holding his gun tightly. "What do you think that was?" he asked. I shrugged, apathetic. "Probably just an animal," I said. "These people around here, they're superstitious. They think the boogeyman is..." But at that moment I saw not a monster, but a child fleeing out of the woods. It was a little Siberian girl, no more than 7 or 8, her facial features a mixture of Asian and white, reminding me of the Buryats I had known, an ethnic minority in the region. She had a look of pure and utter terror on her face that told me this was no animal chasing her. I quickly opened my door, running out into the freezing winter. Because this was a Japanese truck, the driver's side was on the right, making me closer to her than Yakov. "Little girl," I said, "what are you doing out here in the middle of nowhere? You'll freeze to death. Were you with those men? Are they your family? Did they kidnap you?" She looked shell-shocked, her eyes widening as she saw me. "I was kidnapped, yes," she said, "but not by any man. Please, sir, get me out of here. My twin sister is still back at the hut. She needs help. That thing is going to eat her." Then she put her face against my chest and cried, "It was the Baba Yaga. She's real. Please, I don't want to be eaten." I grabbed the hysterical, screaming girl by the hand and began to pull her towards the truck. At first, she hesitated. Then she began to run ahead of me, flinging herself into the cab and looking back out with huge, dark eyes, like a gopher peeking out of its hole. That shrill, hateful shrieking from the woods had nearly reached me by this point. I couldn't make out any words in it. It seemed like just guttural cries of fury and hunger. I began to back up towards the truck, my pistol still raised, refusing to turn my back on anything that sounded like that. And then I saw the silhouette, breaking through the trees. At first, I thought it a polar bear, this looming shadow that snapped solid branches aside like they were twigs. But instead, I saw a woman standing over 8 feet tall with mottled gray skin and a wrinkled, gaunt face. One of her eyes looked pure white, as if covered in a cataract. Her other had a strikingly pure blue iris with a deep, large pupil staring out from the middle, roving over the landscape before focusing on me. Her nose stuck out like a beak, sharp and curving, a few inches long. On her neck, I saw a necklace, holding the fingers of children, dozens of them, some rotted to bones, others fresh and still dripping blood. She saw me, looked at the gun, and then at my face and smiled. "You don't need to die too, friend," she said in a sickly, choking voice, a trickle of blood coming from her mouth and rolling down her chin as she spoke. "Give me the girl, and you can leave in peace. What's mine is mine." I didn't even respond, but simply fired, aiming at her chest. She fell back, screaming again, and I turned and ran towards the truck, slamming the door and starting the engine. The pickup truck had gone, and I couldn't even see its lights in the distance anymore. I started to go forwards, slowly pushing the car aside with my truck. Yet I couldn't get it to budge more than a few inches as it seemed to sink down into the snow. I tried reversing, but I couldn't get the momentum on the slippery ice, as the road sloped downwards at an angle towards the right side. I didn't have enough clearance to try going forwards either. I was stuck. To make things worse, I looked outside the window and saw the Baba Yaga was gone. Only a small puddle of black blood marked the spot where she had lain.